We are back again, and now beginning to look at more detailed versions of the evolution of behavior. Now, what have we accomplished so far? We have spent a huge number of lectures looking at how the nervous system works, starting at the level of a single neuron and our usual story of expansion there, up to the level now of vast parts of your nervous system regulating behavior, how your body changes during behavior. And what we shifted to in the last lecture was the start of a next long stretch of these, namely looking at the things that modify how your nervous system works. And what we started off with in the last lecture, the long view, if you're talking about nervous systems, genes for behavior, genes for how the nervous system works, what you are implicitly talking about thus is where did those genes come from? How did they evolve? And looking at the evolution of behavior. And what we saw in the last lecture was the same sort of Darwinian logic that tells you where the giraffe got its long neck from, also tells you how we've evolved the evolutionarily optimal set of behaviors. What we first did was trash the Marlin Perkins world of animals behave for the good of the species, and instead shifting to the three building blocks of contemporary evolutionary biology. Number one, not for the good of the species, individual selection, passing on as many copies of your genes as possible. A chicken is an egg's way of making another egg. Then the next layer, sometimes the way you maximize those copies of genes, helping relatives, kin selection. I'll gladly lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And then the third layer, that world of reciprocal altruism, the very strict rules with which that happens. Now, what we're going to do in this lecture is focus in more detail on a couple of ways in which these principles apply. In this lecture, focusing mostly on those first 2 levels, individual selection and kin selection. Now, the first example is a fabulous one simply because of how explanatory it is, how predictive it is. Okay, you are off in an expedition in your local neighborhood park, and unexpectedly you discover a new species of primates in there. And you know next to nothing about it except as follows. You observe the animal whose skull I'm holding here, and what you see, the only single fact you get about this animal before it tragically falls out of a tree and you wind up with its skull is this was a female. She was nursing a baby. Meanwhile, equally tragically, over in the next tree, you have another individual, and here the skull that I'm holding. And what you have in this case is, you know this guy was a male. You saw he had a penis, so you've got the sexes sorted out, and what you'll see is, in this individual, who you know is a male, versus in this individual who, adult female, what you see is a vast difference in what the skulls look like. The male skull is far bigger than the female, amid the brain case, the area that the brain fits into, being exactly the same size, but the rest of the skull much bigger, long muzzle, and most strikingly, this huge, whopping great pair of sharp canines in the male, and meanwhile in the female, these very tiny canines. You know nothing more than these 2 facts that I've just outlined, what the gender is of each of these animals, and the fact that the male has these huge conspicuous canines and the female doesn't. Now, using the principles we went over in the last lecture, you could now generate an astonishing number of absolutely correct predictions about the social structure of this species, how these animals go about their mating, all sorts of other personal facts about them, aspects of their diseases that they get. All of this is predictable simply from those 2 facts. And what we look at here is a classic sort of way of dichotomizing different species, summarized in this diagram, what are broadly called tournament species versus pair bonding species. And what we'll see shortly is this is a classic tournament species, these skulls that I was just holding up. Okay, so we start off here working through the logic derived from the rules we had in the last lecture, individual selection, kin selection, etc. And we go and we look at typical features of tournament versus pair bonded species. And what you see first off is a pair-bounded species, by definition, is pair-bonded. They pair for life, monogamous, they're monogamous. Male and female mates with each other, and they stay together for the rest of their lives. In contrast, what you see in the tournament species is marked dramatic polygamy. Males mating with a lot of different females, females often mating with many different males during one cycle. Okay, so what's the next trait that goes in that? How about paternalism. How much care, how much energy does the male expend raising the offspring? In this case, what you see is a dramatic difference. Over in those pair-bonded monogamous beasts, you see very high levels of male paternalism. In fact, in a lot of the species, the males invest as many calories, as much energy in taking care of kids as the female does. Meanwhile, across the Great Divide into these tournament species, you've got a male who is just mated with 47 different females and 23 of them give birth, and he is not doing any male paternalism stuff. He's got too many kids in that case. Very low levels or non-existent levels of paternalism. Next, this allows us, through perfect logic, to predict the next set of traits about this species. How picky are these males as to who you mate with? And over at the tournament end, this guy, if he mates with a female and she gives birth, what are his obligations? There's zero. This guy is gone. He could be a nomadic male and never see that female again. He will, to be a little bit crude, but he will mate with anybody who's willing to mate with him. You see here very low male pickiness. Meanwhile, in that pair bonded, that monogamous species, if their rule is you get her pregnant and she gives birth, you take care of the kids for the rest of the time. Males are suddenly far more picky who they mate with. Is she healthy? Does she appear to be a competent parent? And things of that sort. What you get there is very high levels of male pickiness. Next, we move on to two traits which wind up being really interesting. How much aggression is there in each of these species? And what you can frame that as, given the individual selection stuff on the part of the male, how much is he willing to aggress with another male in order to get a chance to mate with a female? And what you see is, in the tournament species, tremendous amounts of male-male aggression. Because of another trait, tremendous variance in the reproductive success of males. You get some tournament species where 95% of the reproducing is accounted for by 4 or 5% of the males, and those species, enormous amounts of male-male aggression. Meanwhile, over in the monogamous species, what you see is very low levels of male aggression, and pretty much each male fathers a couple of kids, but not huge numbers. None of this variance of 95% accounted for, low levels of aggression. Then you shift to another trait. Okay, monogamous species, what you've got there is a male who, what he mostly wants to be in this world from an evolutionary standpoint, is almost as competent of a parent as the female is. That's what he's being selected for, parental competence, and what you wind up seeing there is he winds up having a body that's as close to the female as you can get. Not a dramatic difference in appearance. Meanwhile, over in those tournament species, what are males being selected for physically? Not to have the same physical attributes of a female, where if only he could also lactate. What he's being selected for instead is male-male combat. And suddenly you have this world of these huge neon antlers and these huge canines and things of that sort, and very conspicuous displays. You have big physical differences between males and females. Jargon in the field, dimorphism, morphism, morphology, the shape of the body, high degrees of sexual dimorphism. Males and females look real different, and males are selected for their combat ability, as opposed to those monogamous species, virtually non-existent sexual dimorphism. Males and females are being selected for having very similar bodies. Okay. Meanwhile, what do the females want out of their evolutionary perspective on the whole field? What you're looking for if you're a female. What do you want out of the guy you're going to mate with? In the case of tournament species, what are you going to get from this guy? You're going to get competent parental care. Is he going to be the greatest granddad somewhere? No, you're never going to see this guy again after you mate with him. What's being selected for there is the only thing you're getting out of this guy, which is good sperm containing good genes. All you look for there are markers of good genetic attributes, big, healthy, muscular, etc. Meanwhile, over in those monogamous species, what do females select for? Guys who are competent parents. And suddenly you have these species where, how does a male court a female? He goes and gets her a worm and delivers it to her. If you're a monogamous bird species, trying to show, look, I'm capable of doing this sort of stuff. Finally, a very insidious bit of behavior that only makes sense from this world of sort of evolution of behavior, you're in one of those monogamous species and you're a female. The rule is if the guy has gotten you pregnant and you've given birth, he is going to take care of that kid for the rest of time until the child is independent. What would be a viciously genetically logical thing for you to do to abandon your nest? And as we'll see, it's mostly birds that show this trait. Abandon your nest and go get pregnant again with somebody else, because this guy is going to stay back at home and raise your kids. That's the, in effect, wiring of the system. And you are now increasing the number of copies of your genes in future generations, blah, blah. Cuckoldry, I believe, is the formal term for it. You see cuckoldry in monogamous species. You never see it in polygamous and tournament species, because if you abandon your kids, nobody else is going to raise them. Dramatic differences. And what we see with the skulls I was displaying before, a classic tournament species, you get these huge whopping canines in the males, and you don't get them in the females, and that's telling you you are not selecting males in the species for being able to be competent mothers, just like the females do. Classic tournament species, in this case, a savanna baboon. And you see lots of other species showing those traits. And this is the world of peacocks, male peacocks with their peacockery, or whatever the term is. Huge caloric investment on these secondary sexual displays where they look utterly different from the females. Mandrill baboons, where the males have this dramatic facial coloration, which you don't see in the females. The males have twice the body size. Meanwhile, over at the monogamous end, you've got about 600 species of birds and your wondrous poetic swans pining away for each other when their mate dies, or in the primate world, a whole bunch of South American monkeys, like marmoset monkeys, where you look at a picture of them and it's a pair and you can't even tell which is which sex. And you look at them and you look at who's taking care of the kids and you can't tell which sex. What we see here is not just a whole bunch of explanations, but enormous predictive power. Again, go out there and know only one of those facts from this chart about some new species, and you've got a pretty good chance of predicting lots of the rest of the world. Okay, so that's one example. Another example now, and this one is a world of really bizarre genetics that was only recently recognized, and to appreciate it, we need to spend 30 seconds on Mendel, one of those people we heard about in high school biology and probably have not thought about since, from whom we learned our Mendelian rules. And one of the rules that was critical to it is as follows. Okay, here we have on this chart one of those classic pedigree diagrams. You've got your female and your male. By the classic symbols, they have mated and produced this individual. And one of the rules of Mendelian genetics, Mendelian heredity, is it doesn't matter which parent you get which genes from. As shown here, the open circle represents one genetic trait, the closed one a different version, and it happens in this case when the two of them mate, it combines this trait. And here we see switched around. Now it's the female who has the closed circle trait, the male who has the open one, and it produces the same exact outcome. It doesn't matter which parent you get which version of a gene from. That is classic Mendelian science. And what people have discovered in the last couple of decades are a whole bunch of genes that violate that rule. Where in this case, we start off with the open circle, closed circle trait producing this outcome and the offspring. And in this diagram, now we flip the traits, which parent supplies which, and depending on which parent it comes from, you get a completely different profile in the offspring. Mendel rolls over in his grave. This is not common in genetics. Best estimates are, less than 1% of genes show this trait, but these are genes that are now called imprinted genes. And people were highly puzzled what these were about, what they were good for, until it finally became clear. And actually a geneticist at Harvard named David Haig has been the person really giving the clarifying insights, and it comes straight out of our kin selection, inclusive selection, individual selection, our evolutionary principles. Okay, where do you see imprinted genes? First bit of a clue, you see it in polygamous species, tournament species. Back to the logic of that, the male mates with the female and he is out of there, he is gone, no tuition payments, nothing on his part, he is out of there. Once again, he mates with the female once and he never sees her again. and she raises the kids. This thus brings up a term which originally is a term that economists would use and is something used all the time by evolutionary biologists, a very hard-nosed term, but a very appropriate one. There's dramatically different energetic investment in the kids on the part of this male and female. What is the male investing in this case? All the energy it took to produce a couple of sperm and deliver them. And what's the female investing? She's raising the kids all on her own. Now to take that very hard-nosed, unsentimental evolutionary view, the male has a choice. And again, back to the last lecture, the male is not sitting there reading a textbook of evolutionary biology. The male wants, the male chooses, is just a shorthand for saying over the course of a gazillion years, males who have this trait have been selected for, passed on more copies of their genes, blah, blah. We know that that's just a convenient shorthand by now. Okay, what does this male want out of this female? What does this male want out of the reproductive biology of this female? He's got a choice, once again, not the real term, but it is evolved that what is to his advantage that the female invest a gazillion tons of calories on raising his offspring so that the kid is that much more likely to grow up and survive and pass on copies of some of his genes, etc. And what if in the female expending that much energy completely wipes out her ability to mate again, to reproduce again in the future? He could care less. Not only could he care less, he thinks that's a great thing because she's going to be mating with some other guy in the future. Meanwhile, what is her evolutionary logic? Yes, she wants this kid to survive, but if she's a female who's not old enough to be having, this is probably her last kid, she wants to balance the number of calories she invests in this offspring with her, quote, future reproductive potential. And suddenly you have a conflict, an intersexual conflict between the number of kids that the male wants with this female. He's never going to see her again, so he would love for her to invest a ton in his offspring, even at the cost of her future reproductive success, whereas she wants to do a much more balanced strategy. And it turns out that explains the imprinted genes, because every single imprinted gene, where it differs which parent is coming from, shows the same trait. Every version of the gene derived from the male pushes for more fetal growth. And every version of the gene from the female does exactly the opposite, tries to slow it down. And this turns out to be a pattern in every single one of these genes. Let me give you one example. In this case, the gene derived from the male is for a growth factor, a protein which, among other things, stimulates the fetus to grow faster, parentheses, to pull more energy out of the mother for growth. And what you see from the female, the equivalently matched imprinted gene, is a receptor for that growth factor. Back to our obligatory cliche, our key going into the lock. And it's evolved in this evolutionary arms race that the more potent of a growth factor males have been selected for, the more dozy and lousy of a receptor the females have been selected for to try to offset this. And this keeps on being this trade-off you see there. And this is an arms race. And this is an arms race that makes no sense at all with swans who have the exact same interest in each mating being for a certain degree of success, but balancing it against the future. This is what you see in these polygamous species instead, where all the male wants out of this female is for her to invest a ton of calories in this offspring, and all the female wants is instead a much more balanced strategy. And these are all these imprinted genes. So that, for example, if you see a mutant version of one of these where it winds up producing a disease, a mutant and overactive version, for example, of a gene derived from a female, and a fertilized egg doesn't implant in the uterus. This gene is so anti-fetal growth that in an extreme version, it slows it down to that extent. Meanwhile, a mutated version in a male that drives for overactivity, what this produces is this wild placental cancer of overgrowth. And you see here this totally bizarre world of non-Mendelian genes, which only makes sense in the context that males and females, even when they're mating, do not have identical genetic interests in the offspring, and let alone in each other. Very interesting. So, okay, what about us humans? Us humans going about our mating business and trying to make sense of us in the world of evolutionary biology. Do we have any of these imprinted genes? Yes, indeed. We have a whole bunch of them. Not as many as in some other species, and there's a whole bunch of rodent species where they're very, very similar, except for the sort of features we heard about before. Some species, they're polygamous, some they're monogamous, and all the pair-bonded versus tournament species traits going along with them. And what you find is the polygamous version has huge numbers of imprinted genes, and the monogamous version has like no imprinted genes. And then you look at us, and we've got some imprinted genes. And thus you have that disturbing issue. Wait a second, we're the species that came up with Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. We're the species unto death until whatever does us apart and 50-year wedding. And what are we doing with imprinted genes? And what you've got there is this answer. We are not a classic pair-bonded species. We're not a classic polygamous tournament species either. In terms of human measures of sexual dimorphism, males are somewhat bigger than females on the average. Even males have somewhat bigger canines than human females do, but not in the typical tournament range. What we are officially, by sort of the jargon of the field of evolutionary biology, what we are is a tragically confused species. We're not quite monogamous, we're not quite polygamous, and this is great because this accounts for about 90% of our great literature, but nonetheless, evolutionarily, we're somewhere in between, and we've got some of these imprinted genes. Now, more examples of this intersexual genetic competition comes through in other realms. You see one of these in Drosophila, fruit flies, and people who study these guys, again, have all of these things to make sense of, which make no sense except in the realm of evolutionary biology, our principles of passing on as many copies of your genes. Once again, polygamous species, where a whole bunch of males will mate with the same female, and what you've got then is this bizarre world where inside the female's body now are sperm from different males. And this is going to sound like grotesquely science fiction-y, but there has been tremendous evolutionary selection for sperm competition, for the sperm from these different males to compete with each other and leaving on as many copies of their genes as they want. And if we've gone through this sort of formal exercise and saying a baboon is not sitting there saying what he wants his genes to do, that certainly applies to the sperm sitting there. They are not wanting their genes to do something, but what has evolved instead is competition between sperm of different males. And it turns out in Drosophila, these male sperm release toxins that kill the other guy's sperm. There's intermale competition releasing these toxins, and you sit there and you say, this is totally bizarre, and you see an even more bizarre trait, which is, okay, you're the female and you've got all these toxic sperm drooling stuff all over inside you, punching it out with each other. Are these toxins good for you? Absolutely not. And what you see is, over the course of a lifetime being exposed to these toxins, if the female had not evolved something, these toxins would be wiping out her health after a while. Isn't the male concerned about her? No, absolutely not. That same tournament species logic again. He's never going to see this female again, and if in the process he secretes enough toxins that she's never going to be able to reproduce again, but in the process this time he wipes out the other guy's sperm, this is great, exactly what he wants to do. Males have evolved increasingly toxic sperm over time. And some really interesting experiments have shown over the course of about 40 generations of fruit flies, males can increase the toxicity of their sperm. Meanwhile, arms race, Star Wars defense, what are the females evolving? Things to detoxify the male toxins. And once again, you have this ratcheting up in about 40 generations. Females can evolve the means to detoxify the male sperm. What is going on here? This is incredibly depressing. You have Drosophila trying to poison their lovers. You've got humans with their genes punching it out in a woman's uterus while they're picking out the crib for the new baby. What is all of this sort of competition about? It makes no sense at all if we're sitting there back with Marlin Perkins doing our behaviors for the good of the species, genetic traits, even the way sperm function and uteri, if that's the correct plural, function have evolved. What is this sort of tell us? It tells us once again these principles of individual selection passing on copies of genes make a whole lot of sense. Just in the same way as from the last lecture, we had that stupendously depressing scenario of a highly endangered species like the mountain gorilla, where there's occasionally infanticide. How could they do that for the good of the species? They're not doing it for the good of the species. Individual selection. These realms were these behaviors, and as we saw, even the physiology of how a uterus wall thickens or how a sperm functions makes no sense outside of these principles. Okay, so these examples, tournament versus pair bonded species, imprinted genes, sperm competition, make sense relying very heavily on that first principle of ours, individual selection, passing on as many copies of your genes as possible. The last example here is embedded instead much more in that kin selection notion. Okay, so you're watching some species of primate, for example, and you notice here, as shown in the diagram, there's two individuals. There's this female A and female B, and you're sitting there watching them, and suddenly, for some bizarre reason, female A totally attacks female B, chasing her, biting her, that sort of thing. And you sit there and you say, what kind of world is this one now? Random acts of violence, random acts of aggression. A suddenly beats up B. What's going on here? And it is only after you study these animals for a while that you begin to find out that something much more interesting has occurred. You look at female A and you look at female B, and you go back in your records, you're keeping your behavioral observations, and you will have noticed 3 seconds before, or even as much as 3 hours before, kid of B, B's child, and A's child, B's child, has beaten up on A's child. B's child has bullied A's child and taken his lunchbox and his bus change or whatever they're doing out in the savannah there. And suddenly, an hour later, A attacks B. What do you have? You've got the McCoys and the whoever it was, or half of Shakespearean play. You've got retribution within families. Why is A attacking B? Because A knows all about kin selection, or doesn't know about but has been selected for. What you see there are patterns of aggression go very heavily along lines of inter-pedigree, and this makes no sense at all until you understand this whole notion that sometimes the way to maximize the number of copies of your genes you're passing on to the next generation is taking care of relatives. And we're back to that same realm. The female will defend her offspring against an infanticidal male, very rarely to the death, but certainly to one extent. And again, it's that same evolutionary balancing between wanting to maximize your genes, the present kid, versus future ones. None of this makes sense to Marlin Perkins. All of this makes sense from the standpoint of evolution as this wind tunnel that sculpts not only optimal necks in giraffe and optimal kidneys to retain water for some desert rodent, but optimal behaviors as well. Okay, so this marches us through some examples here. We're applying these principles of individual selection and kin selection. And basically, this is really depressing stuff. The amount of selection for competition down to the level of sperm trying to kill each other. And what we've got here is nature bloody in tooth and claw, and this seems really demoralizing. And the truism that all the evolutionary biologists bring up at this point is there's a difference between is and ought to be. What ought to be in a world of pure benevolence and peaceable kingdoms and John Lennon singing Imagine and that sort of thing is nonetheless not what biology has selected for. You get this picture of evolutionary sculpting of huge amounts of aggression and competition and that sort of thing. Now, just as you're about to decide this is all inevitable, we come back to that third piece of our grand scheme, that reciprocal altruism stuff. And out of there comes a whole world not selecting for aggression and competition and stabbing the other guy's back and abandoning your nest and cuckoldry and things like that. There we see a whole world of evolutionary selection for cooperation, for altruism, all sorts of things that counterbalance this. And that will be the subject of our next lecture.